distinguished guests, colleagues, and our panelists. It is a pleasure to welcome you to this timely and highly relevant discussion on the nexus between energy, geopolitics, and economic growth, an increasingly complex triangle that is reshaping the international landscape. We have now an hour at our disposal, so I will quickly shift into my questions to our distinguished panelists, and I may open the floor for you to ask some questions on our experts. Our panel today will explore how nations are navigating this new energy order, forging fresh partnerships and confronting both age-old and emerging challenges in the pursuit of energy security and sustainability. Across the globe, access to secure, affordable energy is fundamental to economic development and political stability. Energy underpins everything from industrial productivity to digital innovation, from social well-being to national sovereignty. Yet today's policymakers must operate in an energy environment marked by deep uncertainty, sharp geopolitical tensions, and mounting climate imperatives. In Hungary, and indeed across much of Central and Eastern Europe, this is not an abstract debate. The energy crisis triggered by the war in Ukraine, the volatility of global energy markets, and the pressure to diversify supply sources have placed the region at the center of a wider geopolitical realignment. For us, questions about pipeline dependencies, access to liquefied natural gas, investment in renewables, and nuclear modernization are not theoretical. They are urgent strategic policy issues. But Europe is not alone in this, we might have to say. Developing countries face their own distinct challenges as well. For many, the immediate concern is not decarbonization, but electrification. Access to basic energy infrastructure remains uneven, and investment is often constrained by external regulations or financial instruments that favor low-carbon solutions in contexts where such transitions may be economically or technically unfeasible in the short term. On the other end of the spectrum, key global economies, we might talk about the United States, are witnessing a parallel energy evolution, domestic shale and natural gas production, debates around clean subsidies, industrial reshoring, and the strategic control of rare earth minerals used in renewables. Meanwhile, countries like India are balancing their role as global climate actors with the very real needs of rapidly growing and energy-hungry population. This panel is therefore an opportunity to bring together diverse voices and regional perspectives to explore how differing access to energy, differing policy priorities, and differing regulatory frameworks create both tensions and opportunities in the global energy landscape. Hungary, like many countries, must simultaneously pursue energy diversification, affordability, and environmental sustainability. This energy trilemma is not unique to us, but our position at the crossroads of East and West, and our reliance on both traditional and emerging partners makes the conversation particularly immediate. Thank you for having me these thoughts. And I might shift now with our first question to the panelists. And it might be, how is differential access to energy, whether if we are talking about the fossil fuels, nuclear, or renewables, reshaping today's geopolitical alliances and rivalries? Mr. Krapa, if you may start.
Yes, by all means, and thank you very much. I think we're essentially dealing with a critical, question, and underpinning the question are two fundamentals. I think a long-known fundamental of the role of energy and energy security on economic security and socioeconomic development, and a now new fundamental of the need to decarbonize. So the sustainability question. I think the differentials are starting to open up a bit more starkly the place of energy in the geopolitics of the world. You've seen a shift, for instance, from gas from Russia to Europe, now more into the Americas and North Africa and the Middle East, and that opens up, the question of LNG infrastructure and the place of, partnerships in the geopolitics of the world today. You're seeing also the question of renewable energy and how countries like China, which have a significant hold of the technology and the critical minerals. I think, if I'm not mistaken, about over 50% of the manufacturing and installation is controlled by China, and so that also has an impact. And through its programs, the Belt and Road programs, and all the other programs that it has, it's able to forge partnerships. You're seeing also hydropower potential when you talk about renewables, together with, excuse me, the problem with serving dinner immediately before the panel. But you're seeing the hydropower potential with, countries that are blessed with that resource. Norway, for instance, the Renaissance Dam in Ethiopia, for instance, and how that is also forging partnerships. For instance, if you talk about the dam in Africa, intra-Africa partnerships. And so the differential in access is itself shaping geopolitical partnerships. I think if you look at nuclear energy, for instance, although public opposition, regulatory issues sort of have constrained the uptake of nuclear, you still have countries like China and France and Russia leading with exporting expertise into different parts of the world, and that also contributes to a certain degree of partnership with the countries where these technologies and expertise flow into. So I think we're seeing it shape up in terms of the geopolitics. We're going to naturally feel the competitiveness more. You would find that countries with abundant renewable, sustainable energy sources are attracting more investment, green industrial investment, and that opens the differential up even more. And therefore, the need for us to start to tackle and look at the closing the differential gap. And I think we have to focus really on the main issues that sit on the table all the time, and which everybody ducks around: financing, technology, and perhaps with technology, great infrastructure, cross-border great infrastructure, and what have you. But I think we have to pay attention to those issues. Financing. If you take a country like mine, Ghana, we have discovered significant amounts of hydrocarbon resources. We produce oil and gas, which is, over the last 15 to 20 years, impacted the economy of my country. We're injecting and uptaking renewables, but not at a pace that one would have thought from Paris in 2015. One would have thought the pace would have been more than that, but it's a question of financing, and it's a question of technology, and the differentials have to be, the gap has to be closed. Otherwise, we're going to see energy starting to contribute a bit more aggressively in the shifting dynamics of the geopolitics of the world. And I think that becomes a different problem that nobody wants to see. And countries that have resources, for instance, in renewable. If you're not careful, you'll see nationalism, you'll see dominance, and that opens the differentials, the gap even wider. Something that I don't think at this very crucial time we need. Thank you.
Please.
I'll keep my opening comments brief and to the point. I must say, I come from a country which has an ancient civilization, but a new nation. And the very civilizational values that we bring to the table, and that is why we have the sense of a shared responsibility where energy, the new energy mix or model that you're speaking about. India believes in the five elements of nature. We worship the five elements of nature. So we understand the responsibility that comes with it. So this new energy model that you speak to us, while India was on a development trajectory, a developing nation, this new energy model was thrust on us, and I'll be very open to to this. Just about when we are trying to ensure energy security, ensuring every citizen of a vast country like India, which has a population of 1.4 billion people, to ensure that they were energy secure, they had energy, which is part of the welfare scheme of every nation. We were told about this entire shared responsibility model. So I must say, India does realize that we have a responsibility because we come from the belief of Vasudeva Kutumbakam, that we are one family, but it cannot be equally shared responsibility. Because when fossil fuels were being used to develop nations and developed nations went on to become the nations that they are, the powerful nations that they will have to take more onus of it. And when Herbert was speaking, I couldn't help but speak about the fact that India has been the voice of the global south, which is talking about the commitments that need to be made with regards to finances. So I would just put it, it may sound blunt, but I must say it, put your money where your mouth is. That give us the funds. When we talk about technology, we do keep speaking about it in forums, we keep speaking about some really cutting edge technology coming from the Western region, from the Western parts of Europe, from even United States of America, then please share that technology with us. Let it be an open access for nations which are developing, which are part of the change, and be able to create that. So as far as India is concerned, we did partner, we did make commitments which were way above our need to grow. Those were ambitious targets, continue to be ambitious targets, and we are achieving those targets. We are on track to the 2030 target that we have set. We are almost 50% on track. We have another 5 years to go. Having said that, we do come with, while the targets are ambitious, but we are also grounded with the reality of development for all and taking everybody along in the development story of India. So, like I said, we are on target, we are working hard, and we are ensuring that we play a responsible role in addressing the concerns globally, because it will obviously impact every single life back home in India. Thanks.
Thanks for having me here. And I guess sort of representing or trying to a U.S. perspective on this question, I generally think of the geopolitical dimensions of this as being between consumer states and producer states. And the US is sort of in an interesting situation because it's been both at various times of its existence. Obviously, it was a big producer of energy, a net exporter of energy, or sort of energy intensive goods as it rapidly industrialized, sort of like what Priyanka was talking about. I mean, it was America's sort of early production of hydropower that produced the material that helped win the Second World War. And then as it shifted more to a services economy and as conventional resources were depleted, it became a net importer. But now that's changed again. And the US, after having kind of flatlined in, for example, natural gas production between the 1970s and the 2000s, has more than doubled its natural gas production between 20 years ago and today. And facilities in the United States that were intended to import LNG have now been retrofitted to export LNG. A lot of the domestic consumption of LNG, of natural gas, has replaced and allowed coal plants to retire, which is even more than renewables, the singular leading cause of emissions reductions from the US energy sector. But it leaves us in an interesting place where I think we're trying to decide whether to cycle that surplus production into our own domestic economy for the production of additional power to fuel an onshoring of manufacturing, to fuel a rise in artificial intelligence and the data centers that are required, or alternatively, whether to send that surplus abroad, realizing that we have enough potential surplus production of natural gas to do a little bit of both. But just speaking from the perspective of a company headquartered in Texas, which is a huge market for energy all on its own, and could be considered in some ways almost separate and apart from the United States. We've just seen an enormous projected rise in demand for electricity, which electric power is a good barometer of the way fuels cycle into a domestic economy. So if you're ever wanting to understand whether a state is kind of being vertically integrated and gaining the most out of its energy production, the amount that it cycles into electric power is sort of a relevant statistic to use. And in Texas, we're seeing right now a grid that has a peak of around 90 gigawatts coming up this summer, but is expected to be about 140 gigawatts of demand at its peak hour in 2030. That's the equivalent of adding an entire United Kingdom to the Texas power grid. So a huge amount of electric capacity forecast to be added. It'll be really interesting to see and a lot of these decisions get made at the local and state level, whether a state like Texas, which is reputed to be among the most friendly for permitting and siting energy infrastructure, can pull off a China-like permitting and siting achievement to accommodate that growth, because we have not seen that rate of growth really since the Second World War in the United States. But the projections for electricity growth in the United States right now are completely astounding. And just from my former experience being a utility regulator, I can tell you that there are a couple of sort of primary variables that always need to be balanced in the utility sector: affordability and reliability. Though that's already very complicated math because they trade off against one another. And sustainability or climate is kind of a third variable that's been forced into this bucket. And, it's the last in, and it'll be, I guarantee you, the first off if reliability and affordability are threatened. I don't think the American political climate at this time is tolerant of sacrificing affordability or reliability, or for that matter, its national interest in terms of energy dominance. In view of sustainability objectives. It is in that regard amazing how the dialogue has changed so swiftly since only a few years ago. And candidly, it's not even just the Republican Party, but even the Democratic Party that's now prioritizing those other variables, especially affordability, over the kind of sustainability, which is taking more and more seemingly a backseat in American political discussions in the energy sector.
Okay, thank you very much for inviting me to join the panel. So the question here is about how does differential access to energy shape geopolitical strategies? And I think the important context here is geopolitics. More broadly, what's shaping geopolitics right now? What is emerging? What is emergent? And it seems to be that the big thing that is emerging doesn't just have relevance to energy in terms of the economy, but also military and diplomatic positioning. And what is this changing context? Well, I think the emergence of AI is the emerging context here, and it has huge significance in terms of how we think about energy as a geopolitical factor. It's worth mentioning first, AI, people worry that it'll eventually become conscious. Personally, I think this is nonsense. AI is simply a tool. It's not, you don't have more and more AI and end up being conscious. Conscious is the wellspring of intelligence. I don't think AI is intelligence. It's just a very clever piece of software or a very clever algorithm, which is a means to an end, but the ends are set by us. And but the problem is, it is still a tool, and the nations that have the most powerful tools will outcompete the others. And so the issue with this is that with AI, the nations that have, in a sense, algorithmic sovereignty, or perhaps we could say, those nations will not only have economic competitiveness, but they'll actually have diplomatic relevance, and they also have military sovereignty. And the big problem right now with AI is this: that if you look at computing for the last 70 or 80 years, the major limit on computing was Moore's law, that computing would double every 2 years. Now, I don't know if everyone knows, but that's actually slowed down since around 2010. As of now, Moore's law is more 2.5 to 3.5 years to double. That's because chips are reaching their thermal and atomic limits that you can, and so they're starting to 3D stack chips and so on. There's different approaches, but the actual transistors themselves have basically reached physical in terms of physics, their limit. And so actually there is a thing that's not often spoken about, I think now, which is that the limit on computing is no longer computing power, it's energy. The computing power is outstripping already the energy supply. This is a fairly new problem, and it's particularly the problem when it comes to AI. Why? Because with AI, to build a large model, the power required to train a large model is the equivalent of 1,000 homes in the United States for 1 year to train one model. That's quite a lot of energy. And so what we're seeing is not only companies competing with AI models, but states will be competing with their AI models. And so what we see increasingly is the demand for energy is growing exponentially, while the supply of energy is sub-exponential, and that's a euphemism for it's certainly not keeping up. And so there is this real tension between the supply of energy and the need for energy in the context of not intelligence, but artificial computing power. Let's just stop. Sorry, I have a pet peeve about the phrase AI because I think it's marketing, and I think it's nonsense. It is intelligence in the same way that oat milk is milk. Oat milk is not milk; it's an emulsion that looks a bit like milk. Okay, it's exactly the same thing. So let's just get rid of the marketing term. It's just very advanced algorithms and software. So the issue in the past has been chip density, processing speed. As I've said, those have reached the limits. The issue now is energy. So energy isn't simply a matter of energy sovereignty. It's diplomatic relevance and it's military sovereignty. And so really the future we're facing in the context of this tool of AI, of advanced algorithms, is whether we choose to be algorithmically sovereign or to be dependent. And this is an old debate. If you go back and look at international development theory since the 1950s, it's all been about dependency theory, or at least one branch of it was dependency theory, countries become dependent. We're in a position where nation states that thought themselves to be sovereign, and we keep talking about sovereignty, here we are in Hungary, sovereignty is a big issue here politically. But actually, the energy power that we're able to have, and indeed the grid capacity to support that energy, are the determining factors as to whether nations will be sovereign or not simply economically, but militarily, and crucially diplomatically relevant. And so that's I've talked a bit too long probably, but that's my basic point. So the point is, electricity becomes destiny in the context of computing. It's not about, the issue is not computing power anymore. It's energy to power the computing you wish to have. And that would be my general comment on this theme of differential access to energy sources in the context of geopolitical strategy. Geopolitical strategy is about these computing tools right now, and that's about energy. Thanks.
It's tough to follow, Callum. So I'm going to try to see if I can just connect some dots through a set of examples. Right. The question is energy and geopolitics, and what do they have to do with each other? I don't think that we've ever really been in a situation in which they've been more connected. That's point number one. And point number two, to follow up or to just start with what Hungary's foreign minister said this morning, and that is that the ideologization, I got that right, and the politicization of energy questions and how this enters into the climate action conversation is an integral part of that, I think. So I want to see if I can illustrate that by giving you 4 examples. First one is Nord Stream. So either the United States or Ukraine blew up Nord Stream. That's it's almost certainly true. Number one. Number two, Nord Stream was owned by Germany and Russia. So you have this absurd situation that Germany, together with and then the guys who did it fled to Poland, and the Poles didn't want to extradite those guys to the Germans, and the Germans just took it. And this happened in the middle of a war where the Ukrainians were dependent on almost entirely the largesse of countries like Germany and Poland and the United States in the Biden period and so on. Right? The nexus of issues and the genuine absurdity of all of this is really impressive. That's example number one. We could do a lot more on that example, but let's move to example number two. Herbert mentioned nuclear. Right? So Kazakhstan just the other day made a decision that it was going to, a couple of months ago made a decision that it was going to build nuclear power reactors, right, for the production of energy, which is a big deal because Kazakhstan, very, very soon after it became independent, after the implosion of the Soviet Union, made a huge deal out of the fact that they're going to be a nuclear-free zone. So this is it was one of sort of the flagship, initiatives of the then president Nursultan Nazarbayev, and so that has been reversed now. So that's interesting. But what's even more interesting is that Kazakhstan just a few days ago commissioned Rosatom, so Russia's nuclear agency or whatever, to build the first reactor, and then they got a Chinese company to build the second one, and that means that the French lost out. Of course, because if there's some kind of a connection or a nexus between geopolitical considerations and energy considerations, why would you award any contract if you're Kazakhstan to France? What possible geopolitical benefit could you get from that? Aside from the fact that they're more expensive and all that other stuff. But even putting that aside, they do have style, and that's important. But apparently not enough. So that's example number two. Example number three, I live in Azerbaijan, so I want to talk about something called the Southern Gas Corridor. Southern Gas Corridor is this very complex three-part pipeline mega project that went fully online at the end of 2020. The first part goes from Azerbaijan into Georgia. Second part crosses Anatolia and gets to the border of the European Union. And then the third part goes through Bulgaria, Greece, Albania, under the Adriatic Sea into Italy, right? Huge, incredibly serious, sophisticated. The governance structure, everything is complicated. And has been incredibly successful, and part of Azerbaijan's argument, for sure, which is correct, is that the gas that was transported along the Southern Gas Corridor is one of the two or three most important reasons why, when the European Union chose to impose sanctions on the Russians, why it was able to. Why the European Union or parts of the EU didn't freeze, because of this gas that came from Azerbaijan that came online just a few years before this current stage in the conflict over Ukraine started. Now, the point is, however, that a couple of years later, in the context of the war, right, the European Union and Azerbaijan, Ursula von der Leyen and Ilham Aliyev, the president of Azerbaijan, signed an MOU that talked about doubling the capacity of the Southern Gas Corridor, right? And the logic of that was that, I won't get into how that's done, but it's not that hard technically to do. It requires financing, and it requires commitments for longer term contracts. And at the same time that this MOU was signed, the European Commission did not change its two most important regulations with regards to pipeline gas. namely that they've banned the financing of all new oil and gas, or even the expansion of existing, as would be the case in the context of the Southern Gas Corridor. They've banned all financing of hydrocarbon projects, right? And they've made it impossible for any country or any utility in the European Union to sign long-term contracts for pipeline gas for the sake of saving the planet. Now that's nice, and who would be against saving the planet? Except that the direct consequence of this is that European Union member states, or that is to say the consumers in EU member states, who are taxed more than anybody else on earth, are going to be paying more for energy, even more for energy, as a result of decisions like this. Which brings me to my fourth example. In the same context that Azerbaijan signed this MOU with the EU to double the capacity of the Southern Gas Corridor, it signed another MOU with Hungary, Romania, and Georgia to build a mega undersea cable project that would transport energy or electricity produced from wind and solar in Azerbaijan and a little bit in Georgia, all the way into the European electricity market. Now that sounds great. There's a second part that would involve Kazakhstan and Uzbekistan, and then under the Caspian, and that would then feed into this first part and so on. There is a feasibility study that is going to be released very soon, and I'll bet you whatever you want that it's going to be positive, but it'll be positive not just for geopolitical reasons, which in theory should have nothing to do with feasibility studies, but because the price point for electricity produced from renewables in the EU is higher than anywhere on earth. And you guys want to keep paying for this. Great. And that's the only reason this is going to work. So the geopolitics of energy production and export is, again, more intimately connected than it has ever been before. And it's only going to continue to be the case as we move forward. There is no chance that you're going to, between now and forever, that very simple, basic, all the stuff that we learned in our first week in Intro to Economics, that anything that has to do with energy is going to be determined by anything resembling pure market forces. And the European Union, particularly, is the one place on earth where that is going to be increasingly distorted over time. Now, how in God's name is this going to help the European Union remain competitive in a world in which you have geopolitical locomotion and geoeconomic transformation is very difficult for me to understand. Thank you.
You stated that there were no time when energy and geopolitics were more connected, and that is true. Like in recent years, in the political discussions, we experienced that there were a lot of talking about renewables, responsibility in reaching the climate targets, reducing the GHG emissions, maintaining energy dominance, and also the AI takeover. And you all mentioned all these things. So now the question came that, are we witnessing a new energy bloc world overtaking space now?
Well, are we? I think that's the goal. Clean, green, sustainable is the goal. But are we witnessing that? I think it's a significant question. It's a crucial question. I don't think we are. I think the targets keep shifting. I think the ambition keeps being elusive. I think the reason is simple. The transition comes with supply constraints, infrastructure, finance, technology constraints, as well as demand realities, the realities of people who have no access to electricity, and the impact of that on their livelihoods. I said in Marseille when we were there a couple of days ago that the often quoted figure of 500 to 700 million people, depending on who's quoting, of Africans who have no access to electricity. That energy security, lack of access, is staring economic security and the climate conversation right in the face, and we really have to prioritize for developing countries which way to go. And I think while it remains an ambition, and while we're seeing significant movement in places where, frankly, we should, there's many places where we're not seeing that shift, and it's because first, it's expensive to do for many parts of the world. It will cost twice for the same technology to deploy integrate a renewable energy project in Ghana, my homeland, as compared to anywhere in Europe, in the Netherlands, in Germany, anywhere else. And I think it's important that we pay attention to those issues. We need a more integrated, multilateral, bilateral conversation about partnerships for renewable projects. And we need joint projects, cross-border electricity grid projects, as we've just heard about. We need innovative financing. We need to be able to develop capacity for domestic currency financing. We need to be able to pool resources for R&D. We need to be able to harmonize policy. We have to be able to do those things. We have to be able to have the capacity to provide the incentive for deploying renewables, importing panels, adding value to critical green minerals wherever we find them. We need to be more serious about these variables. Otherwise, we keep talking about the transition. We keep talking about developing the new energy block, but I honestly don't believe that it happens with the pace of financing that we're seeing. In Ghana, we have an energy transition framework. Our goal is to reach net zero by 2060. Originally 2050, adjusted to 2060. And I think if you look at the fact that the entire continent contributes something about 5% of emissions, CO2 emissions, then I was telling Priyanka in the room earlier that if you look at my country, Ghana, we probably can't even compute how much we're contributing. It's negligible. And to say that we should focus less on our oil and gas resources, we've just moved significantly to onshore as well. And I suspect by the end of the third quarter of this year, we would have started drilling onshore. To say that we should focus less on those and more on renewables at the expense of the impact that hydrocarbons have on our economy would be asking something that is hopeless and helpless, and I don't think anybody is able to do that. We are doing integrating renewables. We have the largest floating solar on the continent, which is sat on the Bui Dam project, a hydropower generating peaking dam. We have the largest rooftop solar on the continent, which I had the duty to commission. We have solar farms. We're doing significant work on bringing in nuclear. We've done significant work to bring in wind, onshore wind. We're not resting and saying at all that this is a conversation that is very far away from us, but we're contributing to the effort in a more practical way as to carry our people along economic growth and development, as well as building greener and more sustainable sources of energy.
Thank you.
So, if I may say so, there is no new energy block that we can see for a long time to come. What we are actually seeing is, under the garb of national sovereignty, that we are seeing a new theater of war and supremacy. That is what we're seeing. Global South, since we are very concerned, we are in the Central Europe right now, we're hearing a lot of Europe and gas pipeline, etc. Back in the Global South, we are still trying to ensure energy security. But what is happening in our country as well as neighboring regions is that we are transitioning much faster simply because in order to have electricity at home or power at home, to have energy at home, we are transitioning to more cheaper models. Solar power, which used to be very expensive back home in India, has now come down to almost 2 rupees per unit. So people are moving at people who had no energy at home, no power at home, are finding it easier to transition. So there is no discussion about that. There is an absolute agreement that yes, this is good for our better futures, collective futures. Having said that, we must also be considerate of the fact that in the Global South, wars have been thrust on us to prove supremacy over acquisition of rare minerals, for gas reserves, for various other issues, and Africa has faced the brunt of it. I will go back to, and I'll be just to bring context into this entire discussion about Global South, which usually gets lost in the discussion. When COVID struck, if India would not have been self-reliant, if India would not have had skin in the game in manufacturing of the vaccine, probably you would not have large parts of African continent having a vaccine. Because in the times of trouble, we saw most of the allies and responsible allies, which are telling us what global rules of law are, abandoning us. So same works with energy. We understand the concerns, the larger concerns that you all are facing, but we have faced the brunt of not having anything at all and starting from scratch and believing that we'll be looked after, but realizing that we are all on our own at the end. So I think that is what matters and what really we need to work on. And India totally consciously understands that. We will be ideology agnostic to ensure every single citizen of the country has access to energy and power. It is part of our economic growth model, and it would be a mix which is comfortable for all. At the same time, understand our responsibility towards regions around us so that nobody else comes and exploits the natural resources in our countries and tells us how to conduct ourselves. So that is where I think I would end it with, and make this, the conversation also be about how responsibility is a shared global responsibility, not just about the global north or the global south. Thank you.
I mean, I do think the U.S. would like to try to form some kind of energy bloc, but it faces certain complications. I mean, in the first Trump administration, he achieved a result where America, for the first time since the 1950s, became a net energy exporter in 2020. That was a significant accomplishment for the United States that spoke to the strength of our oil and gas production. And I think that was viewed then, and to some degree now, as a basis of forming long-term bilateral contracts to export some of those fuels to allies abroad. But now, because of the things that Calum and I have talked about, with the rise of AI and its appetite for energy consumption, a lot of that fuel is going to be directed toward domestic consumption in the United States, and that will inevitably take a priority over international exports. Though America's, our willingness to export does exist to some significant degree in relation to price signals, you still do have the federal government involved in the U.S. Granting licenses for the export of LNG. I do think you're seeing more American activity in the licensure of technologies, both nuclear as well as in financing conventional fossil technologies to other countries with nuclear. The U.S. government has been in a lot of conversations with Eastern European countries to develop nuclear technologies. Secretary Chris Wright, the U.S. Department of Energy Secretary, I think his very first public speech actually was a gathering of African secretaries of energy to discuss how America was now willing to finance and reversing its policy on the construction of coal-fired power plants in sub-Saharan Africa. A reversal that puts the U.S. kind of back in line with China about not making judgments about countries' views on the use of their natural resources. But then, I guess just pivoting a little bit to the American domestic political perspective, it's probably worth noting, just in terms of America's sort of overall competitiveness and how our energy decisions are structured, that unlike 80% of the countries in the world, the power sector is not a state-owned enterprise in the United States. And even though it is subject to close regulation, it's highly fragmented and balkanized into literally hundreds of different investor-owned, municipal, and member-owned electric cooperative utilities. So there's actually, ironically, for the power sector that's going to be the engine of this AI revolution and the electrification movement that we see going on, there really is no national energy policy in the United States guiding any of that, except supply side subsidies in tax policy that the United States has. Pretty much all of this is left up to the decision making of individual states and local regulators, and that is weird and very different than any other country I've basically come across on the planet in my long experience in the sector. So I will say that that there's an interesting tension between parochial interests in the United States as a result of that, and some of the national interests that we've been talking about on that panel. And I think local interests will tend to militate, as you might expect, toward, a bit more skepticism of, high growth at the expense possibly of legacy customer interests, just a bit more cautious than the kind of rapid expansion as a result of a mandate of national interest policy you might see in some other countries. So that's something that I think the Trump administration recognizes and has to grapple with, but this is a century-old tradition of localism in the United States that governs this particular sector. And it'll be interesting to see whether certain states can get kind of out of their own way to facilitate a rapid scale of growth, and then to what extent the national government can really supplant subnational actors that have traditionally regulated that space to announce a very clear foreign policy around energy and act around it, even though some of the things I've mentioned are, I think, good starts in that department.
Please, Mr. Krynjewicz, add your thoughts.
Thank you. Well, the whole climate action architecture, starting from the UNFCCC treaty 1992 to the Paris Agreement, all that stuff, the whole thing, from beginning to end, it's predicated on energy blocks, right? What does that mean? It means that you have what are called the Annex 1 and 2 countries and the rest of the world. So the Annex 1 and 2 countries, especially the Annex 2 countries, because the distinction doesn't really matter. We're talking about countries that belonged to the OECD in 1992. So basically the Cold War West, right? Plus Korea, Japan, and so on. So the fellow traveler Westerners, right? Those, give or take 30 countries, had a legal, and still do have a legal obligation to fund everybody else's, what's called falsely a transition. And I'll explain why falsely later. But the point is that it's 30 on the one hand and 160 on the other hand. Right? You can't get a better definition of energy blocks than that. Now the problem is that the amount of money that these Annex 2 countries are obligated to transfer to the rest of the world is huge. The amount that they've committed to transferring is a lot less than huge. And the likelihood that they will ever get to the point that they will actually put money into the pot sufficient to fulfill the legal obligations is zero. Zero. And that means that all of this net zero by 2050, that dream is gone. It will not happen. It will not happen. And it really won't happen, since the Trump administration has said that they're going to put $0 into that big pot of money. And I can give you the numbers and the figures and this and that. None of that matters. Because the big picture is that we will not achieve this huge, incredibly ambitious, never done before in the history of diplomacy agenda. And that is not the fault of the developing world. It's not the fault of the global majority. It's the fault of these Annex II countries, the give or take the 30 countries, that committed to something that that either they were lying from the beginning by saying, we're going to fund this, Scout's honor, or in the meantime realized how ridiculously expensive it would be to actually do it. So, look, I want to finish this with a quote by the former Vice President of Nigeria, Yemi Osinbajo. This is what he said. No one in the world has been able to industrialize using renewable energy. That's part one of his quote. Part two, which I have to find, is Africa and the entire developing world has been asked to industrialize using renewable energy when everyone else in the world knows that we need gas-powered industries for business. So, let's assume he's wrong. Of course he's right, but let's assume that just for the sake of argument that he's wrong. Then you go back to the first problem, which is that this costs a ridiculous amount of money that's never, and it's never going to happen. So either way, whether he's right or wrong, it will never happen. Now, the difference is that everybody else in the world, except for the European Commission and most EU member states, understand that. The Biden guys didn't get it, the Trump guys do. Japan understands it, Australia, everybody understands except for the European Union. I'm saying this not to, just for sports to pile it onto the EU, but the problem is that that you have this situation in which it simply makes no geopolitical sense, none, zero, and no geoeconomic sense for the European Union to pretend, for the sake of its own internal political debate, that this is actually going to happen. Because if they do, then there is no chance that the EU will ever be economically competitive again, ever. How this is good for the European Union and its member states is genuinely beyond me. Thank you.
Thank you. Ms. Nicholson.
Hi, thanks. So earlier on, one of the panelists mentioned the need for conversation and dialogue to be intensified bilaterally, multilaterally. And but actually, I'm not really sure I agree with this. I mean, I think that there is a broader problem in the world that, and we're at, of course, the Budapest Global Dialogue, so it's about dialogue. And the problem in the world is not that we don't have enough dialogue. We live in an age suffused with conversation. The problem is not the quantity, it's the quality of it. It's not about, at the international level, well, the real problem is, what is the conversation about? It's not that we need more conversation. Often we talk about the need for more conversation without saying what are we actually conversing over, and to what end, to what purpose, with what at stake. And the reason I'm thinking of this is that, you mentioned about energy blocks, and with a C, I suppose, BLOC. And the thing is, I think there is something we should talk about in terms of blocks, but it's with a K or CK on the end, which is you call it the climate block in a sense, in terms of a blockage. And so what do I mean by that? Well, the thing is with an energy block, I mean, I'm not really sure myself what it means. It seems a descriptive term, but it's not really explanatory. It's a description of a pattern of things, but I'm not sure what we do with that information. It's purely descriptive in my view. The real interesting question is almost by negation, how do we talk about not so much energy opportunities in terms of blocks, but regulatory limits in terms of blockages? Because if you look at the entire debate around energy, and if you look at the role of policymaking in terms of how can policymaking overcome artificial differences in competitiveness and so on, and differential access to energy? Well, in my view, one of the biggest sources of differential access to energy is, in fact, policy and ideology. Okay, what do I mean by that? Well, if you look at the climate concern, it's just worth taking a minute, if we've got the time, just to talk about climate for a second, because it hangs over the entire discussion over the last 10 years. So what do we mean by climate change? Now, everyone thinks about the science, of course, but actually, and there's a very interesting politics around climate change. You've got the kind of activist end of the spectrum, and you've got the so-called denier end of the spectrum. I think both of these positions share opposite, but I think symmetrical naiveties. The denier side, well, first of all, let me just say, it's important to remember, why do we care about climate? We care about climate because we presume that A, will have an impact on society, that B, will be negative. I don't think anyone would disagree with that. If it had no consequence, why would we talk about it? So there's a human element. That implies that the study of climate change has a scientific element about the climate, but also a social scientific element about society. The problem is, if you look at the climate denier side, they are, I think, misunderstanding the science. The science of climate change, the science of it is actually very good. It's very good. But so I think they're wrong to be skeptical of the science. But the problem is the other end of the spectrum, the activist end, have an opposite but equal symmetrical naivety, or where they have too much faith, not too little faith. They have too much faith in the social science. So the climate denier side have too little faith in the science. The activist side have too much faith in the social science. Why? Well, what is society? What ought society to be? How does society function internally, mechanistically, even if the metaphor of a mechanism even applies to us, which I don't think it does? What is the relationship to whatever we've decided society is and ought to be in relation to extra scientific factors like climate change? If we had solutions to any of these questions, we wouldn't still be arguing over philosophical questions the Greeks raised 2,500 years ago. Questions of what is, what ought to be, and what's our relationship to these two questions. These are perennial human problems. They're fundamental to culture. We are constantly debating this stuff. Okay, so I'm sounding a bit philosophical. What's the relevance? Well, when you look at the climate debate, the problem with it is that it's not that we don't understand the science, is that we don't understand ourselves. I would even put to you that the climate debate is, yes, of course, informed by a rich understanding of the physical science, but I'd put to you it is as informed, perhaps more informed, by an impoverished understanding of ourselves. And I just don't think we're acknowledging this sufficiently. And so what does this mean? Well, if we start putting in legislation relevant to a view of climate change, of course it's going to limit access to energy. If we're prizing sort of ideological or legislative purity over realism, I mean, basically if you look at the climate discussion, it's more of an exercise in political idealism than economic realism. And who is this affecting disproportionately? It's affecting the countries that adopt it, which is typically the Anglosphere in the Western world, which is causing us a competitive disadvantage. So in a sense, we're becoming an energy bloc by negation. We don't have the leverage. Now, just if I can just wrap up with this, there's a couple of things. I mean, if you pull back and look at the climate debate, it seems to me, and my background's in anthropology, I'm not a geopolitical expert or anything, but I have an anthropological background, and when I look at climate change, what I see is a classic Protestant millenarian movement. It's a movement that's saying we've sinned against the climate, we must overcome it and confront the oppression from climate in this case. Now, this is it's no coincidence that Greta is a Swede. It's coming out of the Protestant countries. The concern for climate change isn't coming out of Catholic countries or Middle Eastern countries or Confucian countries or Hindu countries or cultures. It's coming out of Protestant cultures. That's where it's all coming from. But of course, the Protestant world has written the world in its own image since World War II, because of the outcome of World War II and because of the international institutional system, which is modeled on basically Western European frameworks. So the reason I mention all this is to say that if we're going to be talking about energy blocks, I mean, I think that there is a discussion to be had, but it shouldn't be a positive conversation about what is the nature of an energy bloc. It should be about the negation of how certain nations are disadvantaging themselves in the context of a debate about some basic realities that we can't avoid. We can be as idealistic as we want, but if we're not realistic about what is in fact real, then we're going to end up with a short straw. So my point here, just to be really clear, I'm not taking a climate denier perspective or anything like that. It's about saying we need to just be a bit more conscious of the contextual realities that are implied and sometimes unexamined in how we look at a lot of the issues that we come together at places like the Budapest Global Dialogue to discuss. And I just encourage us to have a little bit more humility in the face of complexity rather than the hubris to think that we can rewrite the world as we think it ought to be.
I just asked Blanca if I could add to this, because I think this is a really good, there's this distinction in that in all of these conversations within the context of the climate debate or the climate action agenda between mitigation and adaptation, right? And this one is idealistic, the other is realistic. The idealists say we can still mitigate. We can still get to, below 2 degrees Celsius global warming. We can get to net zero by 2050 and so on. And that's why all of this money that we, the developed world, are going to give you, the developing world, needs to go to mitigation, because that will get us to this ideal that everybody else thinks is unachievable, right? And as it happens, this is the position of the developed world. That is to say, in your formulation, the Protestant countries, and then some hangers on. Okay. The rest of the world says, we know you're bullshitting. So we're going to focus on adaptation. So put the money in a pot, and then we want to spend it on adaptation, which means we want to prepare our societies for something that's going to happen. Because that's the best way that we can still keep developing and maybe get to prosperity and all that business, right? And the answer that comes from these so-called Annex 2 OECD from 1992 countries, right, is no, we're not going to let you do that. That's fundamentally unjust and maybe evil. We are going to determine how you're going to spend our money by telling you that you can't do what you want, even though you had nothing to do, or basically had nothing to do with creating the problem that we're willing to help solve, even though we had nothing to do with it. It's a schizophrenic way of looking at it, and yet that's where we are.
Thank you. Unfortunately, our time is very limited, but I'm turning to our distinguished speakers to add your closing remarks very briefly. Thank you so much.
I'd like to end it on a positive note.
Thank you. Please do that.
So between the two of being real, being ideal, somewhere between lies India and is working towards it. We are not asking for a lot. We are asking for climate justice and climate finance, which helps us transition. That's point one. But despite our asking and fighting for the rest of the global south, we have started to work on our own, right from setting responsibility with our corporate houses, where we talk about sustainability reporting. Over 1,000 listed companies are reporting on their sustainability index. We have also started the carbon market trading, which has ensured that over 1 million of carbon footprint that we were to, would be contributing towards it would be eradicated. We are also moving towards climate resilient crops. We are also adapting to the idea of working differential hours, because we understand what climate change does, and also moving our diet pattern to more climate resilient way of living. So India is working on all models of sustainability while also seeking large long-term goals in collaboration. We don't seek donors, we seek collaborators. You grow, we grow, we grow, we let the world grow. So that is how we are functioning. So I would want to end it on a positive note.
Thank you. Mr. Krapa?
Blanca, thank you. Is there something else to add? I think it's clear. We're really looking at, I'll end the way I started, 3 fundamentals: economic security, energy security, and the big question of climate change. And the balance between energy security and transitioning into cleaner sources of energy, the balance between energy security and economic security and economic growth, and also the question of the broader climate action matter would remain on the table for a long time. As I said in my earlier comments, we in Africa have contributed less than 5% of those emissions. But we know that if we did nothing and if together we did not decarbonize, we know the consequences of that on a people. Sea levels will continue to rise. There will be more drought. There will be more food insecurity. We know what will happen, and that will culminate even into a bigger economic global catastrophe. And so that responsibility is there, and we'll contribute to it. But we'll do so, as we've heard from the rest of the panel, proportionate to the bigger agenda of bringing our people along economic growth and socioeconomic development. And I think the big talk about putting money into the adaptation and mitigation and transition doesn't look like it's going to happen. The Conference of Parties has rather become a permanent feature for talking about why it is not happening. And I think the sooner we got serious about funding and financing the transitioning, the better for, getting closer to meeting those targets. In my country, our decision is to take advantage of the fossil fuels and use that to finance the transitioning into renewables, since they talk about financing from Annex 2 countries is not going to come. Doesn't look like it's going to come. And we have to finance the transitioning ourselves. And the intelligent, clever way to do that is to utilize the resources we have to be able to meet that. Financing would remain on the table for a long time. Technology would. And we have to be able to harmonize and coordinate policy as well. Incentives and the rest of them. Credit, tax credit and all of that. We need to be able to harmonize all those to see a deeper penetration of renewables and cleaner, greener fuels in the energy mix. I thank you.
I've been asked to be quick, so I'll try to be quick. Look, I'm Serbian, so we have this thing about the Serbian way of looking at being optimistic and pessimistic, right? So the Serbian pessimist says it can't get any worse, and the Serbian optimist says, oh yes, it can. So with that in mind, I just want to say a couple of words about energy transition, because there is no such thing. And this is very important to understand, because an energy transition would require one or more new sources of energy to be on the increase and existing sources of energy to be on the decrease, right? So sure, wind and solar are on the increase in terms of percentage compared to how it was 10 or 15 or 20 years ago. But that's the wrong metric, because the right one is global demand. And this is what all my fellow panelists in one way or another said this. And it's increased. Overall, global demand is increased over this same period, 10, 15, 20 years, so much that the production and the consumption of oil and gas and coal keeps rising. Last year, more coal, more gas, more oil was produced and exported than ever before. That record will be broken this year, and it'll be broken next year, and the year after that, and so on. Okay, so we have energy addition. We don't have energy transition. Wind and solar, with all of their subsidies, all of the political will, all the rhetoric, all the everything, produces only 15% of the world's electricity generation, which is not the entirety of the energy equation, right? So unless we see a dramatic transformation, where instead of replacing conventional energy sources, the growth of renewables is going to come on top of conventional sources. So the mathematical operations are addition and multiplication. not subtraction and division. More energy from more sources. But that is highly unlikely to produce anything resembling what we all say we should be into doing when it comes to, you know, all the UNFCCC stuff and the Paris Agreement and all that stuff. So that's why I'm the Serbian optimist here. Thank you very much.
Can I just mention very quickly about Serbia? I was there's a famous Hungarian phrase. For those who are not Hungarian, it's "Tubic vesed Mohacsnál," which means more was lost at the Battle of Mohacs, which means, if you translate it, just means it could be worse. And it's basically a battle where the Ottomans defeated the Hungarians. And I told this once to someone in Belgrade, and it's a famous battle in Hungary. And this woman who was actually from Kosovo, who was Muslim, she looked at this guy and she went, Mohac, one of our great victories. So anyway, this is so funny if you're Hungarian or Serbian. Okay, so all right, so just to wrap up, I mean, this whole panel has been about fuels in the future, and I've really made 2 points, and I think they're connected. One is that energy is crucial because of the growth of AI, so that's the big limit on AI it seems to be energy. But in the context of this, when we talk about renewables and renewable energies, my argument would simply be that renewable energy, what we think is of as renewable energy, is not in fact green and is not in fact sovereign. It's not green because it requires, in many cases, a lot of rare earth minerals that are not themselves renewable and hugely invasive to extract and geopolitical tricky to do so. And it's not sovereign because the supply chains around a lot of renewables depend on geopolitical rivals in many cases. And we need to be sovereign. So it's not as green as we think it is, and it's not sovereign, but sovereignty is crucial given the energy demands of AI. So in this, I'd just say that, I think the climate framing, and we've heard some rhetoric around the climate framing on this panel, but I think that the climate framing for me is somewhat of a middle-class affectation. You've seen the gentrification of the left in the Anglosphere, at least, where people talk about these issues instead of, working class issues and socioeconomic issues. And then also, if you look at elite institutions, they tend to be populated with people with an MSc degrees in global governance from St. Anthony's College, Oxford. So it's in this sense, it's a very middle class preoccupation, and that's great and idealistic and wonderful. But look, we're living in pretty real times now, and I don't think the threat we're facing is climate change or even strictly AI, but rather the challenge we're facing is ourselves, because we limit ourselves with our preoccupation with climate change, and in doing, we fail to compete on AI as a result. And so I just wrap up just by saying that, I think realism, not idealism, should be the watchword and is crucial going forward, particularly when we're thinking about fuels and the future. Thank you.
Thank you so much, and we are very sorry for overcoming our time, yet we still didn't reach the every important sphere of this topic. So thank you so much for your attention, and thank you for our distinguished speakers for today's discussion. Thank you so much.